Tools, one syllable, 5 letters. A simple word that can refer to virtually every human achievement, a countless number of objects, and even our own evolution. Hi, I'm Ron Hazelton. Welcome to the Tool Bench. You know, when I was growing up, I used to play in my dad's workshop. Tools were like toys for me and my brother. We spent countless hours making soapbox derby cars. And today, I help people all across the country with do-it-yourself home improvement projects. I'm always struck by the special kind of bonding that occurs when a family uses tools to make something in their lives better. And I guess it shouldn't come as a surprise. Tools have been a vital part of the human experience. December 12th, 1998. Astronauts Jerry Ross and James Newman disembarked the Space Shuttle Endeavour. Their destination is Unity, the recently installed American-made portion of the International Space Station. 250 miles above the Earth, Ross and Newman attach a space-age toolbox to Unity. Inside are more than 50 hand tools, wrenches, ratchets, and clamps, which will be used in at least 150 future missions to complete the construction of the space station. These tools are similar to those used on Earth, with a few differences. Handles are wider since the bulky gloves worn by the astronauts make it difficult to grip narrower objects. And most importantly, each tool is equipped with a ring so that it can be attached to the astronaut's suit, preventing it from floating away. Tools are building a future in space just as they've built human civilization back on Earth. These are the very first tools. Chipped stones that are at least 2.5 million years old. Older than the human species itself. In fact, it's possible that tool making helped give rise to humanity.
Our brains, the type of teeth we have, the sophistication in our hands, is all directly related to this 2.5 million year legacy of natural selection for tool use.
A husband and wife team of anthropologists, Nicholas Toth and Kathy Schick, see a link between tool making and human evolution.
It really does seem that tools have made us what we are, that it transformed us from a rather insignificant-looking bipedal ape-like creature on the African landscape into living in the kind of world that we live in today.
The first tool makers were at least 3 evolutionary generations removed from modern humans. They included a species called Homo habilis. His name means handyman. Habilis lived in East Africa and stood about 3.5 feet tall. Primarily an herbivore, he had large teeth for grinding down plants. His brain was about 1/3 the size of a modern human's. But that was big enough to figure out that by striking 2 stones together, he could create a cutting tool with a razor-sharp edge. Schick and Toth often demonstrate how habilis used these tools to become a meat-eater. And whenever they do, they only use animals that have died of natural causes. Today, it's an Indian gazelle acquired from a zoo. They begin by striking the stones in the same manner habilis would have. Once a sharp edge is formed, they go to work. Since tools of this size would be difficult to fell a large, fast-moving animal with, Homo habilis was more a scavenger than a hunter. But this ability to quickly butcher dead animals before the hyenas got to them provided an entirely new food source, a key element for survival and evolution. Besides cutting tools, Homo habilis also used rocks to create hammers and anvils for cracking nutshells and animal bones.
You normally try to do it in a way where you're creating a crack that goes down the long axis of the bone rather than straight across.
Inside the bones, they found an excellent source of protein, marrow.
Then you can open it up easily and remove the marrow, which is essentially a tube of food.
More than providing a good meal, the ability of our pre-human ancestors to use tools might have actually sparked their evolution.
And I don't think it's an accident that starting right after the origins of stone tools, we start seeing the first evidence of brain expansion, the first evidence of a decrease in the size of teeth through time as well. So you don't need these massive jaws and massive teeth to process food because you're using tools to do that instead. It frees you from your biological heritage. You can supplement your biology by the use of technology.
Stone tools would slowly continue to evolve with only a couple of noticeable advances. First, about 1.5 million years ago, came the appearance of larger, flatter tools. They had a wide cutting edge and were referred to as hand axes. Then, about 500,000 years ago, the tools got smaller again, but they were much more refined and had finely serrated cutting edges. Think of them as Stone Age steak knives. When fully modern human beings evolved about 100,000 years ago, they shared the Earth with the slope-browed species Neanderthal. It was at this time that one of the greatest advances in tool technology occurred, the use of a compound tool, tying one tool, a rock, to another tool, a stick, creating a new, stronger tool. About 6,500 years ago, the Stone Age would come to an end, and tool making would change dramatically. Mesopotamians living in Jordan and Israel made an important discovery. When certain colorful rocks were heated to the point of disintegration, they would produce a malleable substance, copper. Copper could be shaped and molded, and when it cooled, was stronger than stone. By the time those ultimate do-it-yourselfers, the Egyptians, began building the pyramids almost 5,000 years ago, many of today's common workbench tools were in use. While wooden mallets and stone hammers were used during the 1,000 years of pyramid construction, Egyptian blacksmiths used both copper and bronze to make saws, chisels, hand drills, and a unique axe-like tool called an adze. In about 1100 BC, it was discovered that a mineral called hematite could also produce an even stronger metal, iron. But to do so, it had to be heated in excess of 500 degrees. To do this, oxygen was used to stoke the fire to hotter temperatures. Iron would be the primary source of tools from the Roman Empire through the 19th century. When we come back, we'll meet the king of tools. The volunteer carpenters of Habitat for Humanity build homes all over the world for families in need. They're often joined by President Jimmy Carter and his wife, Rosalind. The Carters have dedicated much of their post-White House years to this work. But whether you're a former world leader or a shop clerk, you've probably driven a nail or pulled a nail without giving much thought to the tool you used. You might not have known, but the hammer is the king of tools.
It reminds me of something a poet said, "By hammer in hand all the arts do stand." And I think that alludes to why people would call the hammer the king of tools. If you think of creation as forging something, pounding something out, it really evokes the image of a basic hammer. And all throughout history we see just dozens and dozens of different variations on the basic hammer.
Hammers have been used to build our homes, tenderize our meat, and even test our health. But none is more common than the claw hammer. This is a very old tool. In fact, it could have been used by a world leader who lived a long time before Jimmy Carter. Try Julius Caesar. These are actual claw hammer heads forged during the Roman Empire more than 2,000 years ago. This hammer style would endure for centuries. There was really only one thing wrong with it. The head would fly off. Flying hammerheads was a problem that would baffle hammer makers until the 19th century.
Now, this hammer was fashioned very much after the Roman style, which was the very deep arc to the back and the claw so that nails could be pulled. This is not a Roman hammer. This is about early 18th century. The head itself had a hole that was perfectly straight and the head would fall off many times. And what they did was try to improve that by putting a strap forged right to the actual head itself, one on either side.
Strap head hammers were common throughout the 18th century, but they still didn't solve the problem. The straps were too thin to handle much pounding and just snapped at the head as it flew off. It wasn't until 1840 that a New York blacksmith, David Maydole, devised a solution. He was inspired by the design of another ancient tool, the adze. An adze is a wood planing tool that dates back to the Egyptians and is still used by craftsmen today. Maydole, who often repaired the broken hammers of local carpenters, noticed that the adze had a deep tapered socket where the blade attached to the handle. He adapted this concept to the hammer and made what has become known as the adze socket hammer. The deeper socket was key to securing the head.
Other carpenters discovered these hammers, and all of a sudden, David Maydole wasn't just a small-town blacksmith any longer. He was in the hammer production business, and that's what he did. Interestingly enough, he never patented his design for the adze socket for the hammer, and it's something I'm sure he lived to regret, because I'm sure he could have died a wealthy man instead of a humble hammer maker.
Over the centuries, the hammer took on several other interesting shapes and designs. During colonial times, iron tools were rare in America, since the British wouldn't import any to their unruly expatriates. So when iron wasn't available, a tree trunk would make an effective sledgehammer. In stark contrast were these Victorian-era domestic hammers. Nickel-plated steel was used to create delicate-looking and incredibly ornate tools. They were quite popular in proper households for cracking nutshells. In 1902, George Voigt took out a patent on the double-claw hammer. The second claw provided greater leverage for extracting nails. But since the lower claw had to be forged separately, it was weak and often broke. Mittendorfer-Strauss patented this goat head hammer in 1928. Well, it wasn't much of a heavy-duty tool. The long ears made for an amusing nail puller. The hammer was used as a promotional item inside boxes of Billy Boy soap during the Depression. While this cast iron fish head hammer has a certain charm lacking in today's tools, modern hammers possess other qualities that tool makers of the past could never have imagined.
I kind of seriously doubt if the average person looks at anything as simple as a hammer and realizes that the amount of work that has gone into every detail of that.
This is one of the hammer development stations at the Stanley Tool Plant in New Britain, Connecticut. This combination of electronic sensors, digital technology, and human muscle is used to produce a hammer that will minimize the impact on the user's hand, wrist, and arm. When a muscle is in motion, it gives off an electrical signal. These sensors can analyze that signal and graphically display on a computer the impact of every swing and strike. This concern for how a tool impacts the body is summed up by the buzzword of the tool industry today: ergonomics. In practice, ergonomics means using technology to make tools that do minimal or no damage to our bodies.
A carpenter would swing a hammer all of his life, God knows how many thousands of times a day, and never realized that each one of those blows is slowly doing something to his body, because it wasn't like one accident. If he fell off the roof and broke his arm, you'd know that he broke his arm. But if after 20 years of swinging a hammer, he suddenly has trouble moving that arm, well, he's not going to be sure exactly what it was. But it probably was a cumulative trauma disorder.
Impact testing showed the Stanley team something interesting. Shock waves from a normal hammer were transmitted through the arm, similar to the vibration of a tuning fork. Since the goal was to find a way of shortening and numbing that shock wave, they decided to put a tuning fork in the hammer and let it absorb the shock.
Literally put a tuning fork into the handle of the hammer, and what it does is, as the vibration comes through the shaft, it goes into the tuning fork and vibrates it, and it absorbs the shock, and therefore it doesn't get into the arm and into the hand.
In 1998, the tuning fork hammer was officially named the Stanley Anti-Vibe, and it went into production at the company's Shelbyville, Tennessee hammer plant. The Anti-Vibe starts as a small rolled bar of steel called a billet. The billet is fed through an induction heater where temperatures range between 2200 and 2300 degrees Fahrenheit. In just a few seconds, the glowing red-hot billet exits the heater. That incredibly loud noise is the sound of a 1,300-ton press, forging billets into hammerheads. Four magnificent blows from the press, and instantly the billet has been shaped into not one, but a pair of hammerheads.
Our forging process is similar to what the blacksmith forging process was, say, 100, 200 years ago. We do in 4 blows what a blacksmith probably used 100, 200 blows to do to form a hammerhead.
After forging, an important detail is added. The face of the hammer is placed over a grinding wheel that produces a checkered surface.
That checker face is there to make sure that the hammer does not slip off the nails.
Next, the hammerheads go through a battery of finishing and assembly stations. The first stop is at the whirlybird. Here the face and chapper, or circular surface, around the face are polished. A conveyor belt moves the heads from the whirlybirds to the automated robots. These robots are precisely programmed to polish each of the octagonal surfaces connected to the chapper. Finally, actual human beings run each hammerhead on belt polishers to bring a finish to the top and sides. Next, they enter a steel enclosure. Once inside, they pass under the piercing light of a laser beam. This is how the Stanley logo is emblazoned onto the hammer. From the laser station, the heads are placed on racks where they're coated with lacquer for long-term protection from corrosion. The lacquer is applied by electrostatic guns. Like a magnet, this technology uses electrically charged particles to draw the lacquer spray to the tool. Finally, the actual tuning fork is inserted into the head. A powerful epoxy, one that was originally created for the aerospace industry, is used to secure the connection. Now, the grip is ready to be added. The process begins with this box of polyvinyl chloride, or PVC, pellets. The pellets are sucked out of the box by a vacuum hose. They're fed into an injection molding machine where they're heated to a liquid state and molded around the handle. Finally, the Anti-Vibe is ready to pound some steel. While the Anti-Vibe's basic shape harkens back to the Romans, its design reaches toward the future. Next, we'll look at another Roman-era tool that has not only survived, but is the most popular amongst collectors. Now, make no mistake, I love my power tools, but I have to admit there's a certain satisfaction in accomplishing something with a hand tool. And for thousands of craftsmen and hobbyists, there's something especially meaningful about restoring and using vintage hand tools. Many vintage tools were made not only to last, but to be beautiful. Author and furniture maker Sándor Nagylancy photographed such tools for publication in his books, including The Art of Fine Tools. He finds a value in vintage tools that's lacking in today's mass-produced tools.
There's a really special delight in picking up a particularly well-made tool, one that just resonates when it's in your hands. It's no different really than picking up a guitar or a violin and making beautiful music.
For woodworkers like Nagylancy, few tools evoke a greater sense of artistry than the hand plane. This simple tool is used to smoothen and finish wood surfaces. Other variations can create grooves in cabinets and perform numerous other woodworking jobs. Its basic design has been the same for the past 2,000 years. Like the claw hammer, its earliest use can be traced to the Romans. Throughout history, there have been thousands of minor personal touches added to this basic design by countless craftsmen. Because of this, the hand plane is the most popular tool amongst collectors. Its invention was a revolutionary advance in precision hand tools. Its predecessor, the adze, was effective at creating planks from round, rough logs. But the plane could remove paper-thin slices of wood, leaving a fine finish. The plane is like a chisel, with a special housing built around it for increased control, power, and accuracy. Like a shoe, a hand plane has a sole or flat surface that is pushed over a piece of wood. A small slit in the sole allows for the protrusion of an iron or steel adjustable blade. Simple, right? Wrong.
It can be remarkably difficult to use. It takes quite a bit of know-how and technique to set up a hand plane properly and then to use it correctly to get a beautiful, smooth surface. With a plane blade, you're actually going to slice through those wood fibers to get a nice, clean, smooth surface. So that blade has to be very, very sharp. And then the amount of the blade protruding beyond the sole has to be just right. That controls the degree of cut or the size or the thickness of the shaving that the plane is going to produce. And then there's the question of being able to create an even, smooth surface on the tabletop, which involves quite a bit of technique.
Planing is such a precision art that the publisher of Fine Woodworking magazine has produced an entire how-to video on the subject. How you stand even affects how the tool works.
How does it feel? Are you comfortable?
Yeah, it feels pretty good.
It looks a little wide to me. Bring your legs a little bit closer together.
The irony of such a simply designed tool being so complicated to use is just one thing that makes planes so interesting. They're also one of the first tools that had the toolmaker's name engraved into them, beginning in the early 1800s. These were men who didn't make their living making tools, but instead had to make their own tools to make a living. They were also men who took pride in their tools and often made them a work of fine art as much as anything else. Some were crafted from rare materials like rosewood, ivory, and ebony. Some were whimsical. Planes from other parts of the world reflect certain cultural traits or spiritual principles. Japanese wood planes, like the one owned by tool collector Curtis Bowden, are never pushed. They're pulled. Pulling the plane towards the body reflects a Japanese philosophy of bringing all things to center. The spirit of the wood is brought to the craftsman rather than being pushed away. Out of the thousands of craftsmen who have made planes, perhaps the most famous was an American cabinet maker named Leonard Bailey. In the mid-1800s, Bailey developed a number of improvements that are still incorporated into planes today. The most significant resulted in a more precise depth adjuster and better mechanisms for securing the blade. In 1879, Bailey's company, along with his numerous patents, was purchased by one of the emerging big tool corporations of the industrial age, Stanley Tools. Stanley still manufactures and sells Bailey planes today. But the relationship between Leonard Bailey and Stanley Tools was not always an amicable one.
His understanding was he got a certain percent of royalties for every plane made. Stanley wanted to make planes other than the ones designed by Leonard, and there got to be disputes about what Leonard's royalties were based on.
Leonard Bailey left Stanley in 1875 and began making a new line of planes. He called them Victor and Defiance. It's commonly held that he chose those names as a snub to Stanley. The tool company was unperturbed. They continued manufacturing the original Bailey planes and had a covetous eye on Bailey's new planes.
He was a good plane manufacturer. He had some very, very powerful patents. He was not a good businessman. He tried a couple of times and did not do well on his own.
Before the century was out, Stanley would acquire the Victor and Defiance lines from Leonard Bailey as well, and continued manufacturing the two planes through the 1950s. After the reacquisition of his planes, Bailey left the business altogether. He moved to Weatherfield, Connecticut, and became a successful copy press designer. But he has left behind a name that will live on, not only in tool history books, but on the shelves of hardware stores and woodworking shops. When we come back, we'll solve the mystery of why it's so hard to find old saws. Some of the world's rarest tools can be found in this 7-story castle in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. It's home to the Mercer Museum. A Harvard Law School graduate turned amateur archaeologist named Henry Mercer completed the museum in 1916. Mercer felt it was important to preserve the everyday tools used throughout history. It's here that tool collector and author Herbert Keene demonstrates how many of these tools were made and used.
The intrigue was, how in the world could you make anything out of such rudimentary objects such as these tools 100, 200 years ago, and how did they work?
At the Mercer Museum, we're reminded that tools like cordless drills are really not new at all. In fact, cordless drills have been around since the Stone Age. The first drills, simple, sharpened sticks, were made tens of thousands of years ago. This 2,000-year-old Native American drill represented a technological leap because it attached a bit to the stick, in this case, an arrowhead. A short time later, somebody figured out that wrapping the cord of a bow around the stick could make drilling less strenuous and more effective. This very refined example from the 1800s makes the drill look like a cousin to the violin. While bow drills are beautiful to look at, they're not very efficient because of their reciprocal motion. They drill on one stroke and then reset on the next. This medieval-era breast drill solved that problem by providing for consistent motion. But as demonstrated here, it relied on the weight of the user and made drilling holes quite a workout. One of the best drill designs can be traced back to the 1500s. The bit brace might have been inspired by the crook of a tree branch. This bit brace from the early 1800s was used in a shipyard, and its precision craftsmanship is evident.
This piece, being almost 200 years old and still has the precision of the fit, it clicks in by virtue of two end pieces that are shaped like the end of a clothespin. It will not come out under utmost pressure.
Like hand planes, many bit braces came to be elaborately decorated, sources of pride for their makers. And they were not only tools of industry, but tools of medicine.
You look at some of the braces that collectors have on their shelves and you think, oh, well, here's a lovely little bit brace that maybe was used for more delicate drilling because it's only this big. And then the collector will say, actually, that's a surgeon's brace. And you realize that what it was used for was drilling holes in the skull.
With the Industrial Revolution, drill technology advanced. Gear drills resemble egg beaters, but are capable of performing heavy-duty work. Bronze and nickel-plated gears attached to a sturdy crank handle. The user could apply body weight to the top of the drill for additional boring power. While vintage drills and other tools abound in museum and private collections, finding old saws is another story.
They were entirely used up. In fact, a couple of craftsmen that I visited had only a couple of old handsaw handles that had been fitted with modern blades. They no longer had their original blades because they had been used up.
Before the 20th century, saw blades were always one of the most difficult tools to make. Creating one with the delicate combination of hardness, stiffness, and flexibility was a challenge met only by the most elite metalworkers. Then, repeated sharpening by the tool's owner just wore the blades all the way down to the handle. But most saw blades would just buckle and break before they could ever be worn down. For heavy-duty demands such as logging, two-man operated frame pit saws were used. These were first used during the 1700s as recreated by these craftsmen at Colonial Williamsburg. Tree trunks or large wood planks would be laid across a deep pit. One worker would stand above the pit while the other stood in it. The sawing was done vertically rather than horizontally. The idea was pretty good, as long as the bottom man was wearing his hat to catch the falling sawdust. The quality of saw blades would increase in the 19th century thanks to the use of steel. In 1855, a Philadelphia toolmaker named Henry Diston created the first steel melting plant in America. He also built a special rolling mill exclusively for saw blades. These machines would unfurl strips of steel, cut them to size, and stamp them with saw teeth.
The rolling mill went into operation around 1862. Americans were able to buy domestically made handsaws, and Diston became kind of the father of the handsaw in America, and Diston is still a brand name in America today.
Variations of Henry Diston's rolling mill are still used today to manufacture saw blades. Huge coils of steel ground to several hundredths of an inch in thickness snake their way through powerful presses. There they are cut to proper length and for the desired row of teeth. While the blades and the handles are produced by machines, the assembly is still done by hand at most tool plants. While this device may give new meaning to the word power saw, it's actually one of the ways saws are tested. This machine, found at the Stanley Tool Plant, counts how many strokes a particular saw requires to cut through a piece of wood. A combination of ingenuity, technology, and quality testing has resulted in a generation of hand saws that can cut through nearly anything. When we return, we'll learn why in the world anybody would call this a monkey wrench. You want a book? Go to the library. You want a tool? Go to the hardware store. But if you want a book about hardware stores, then talk to Vince Staten. He grew up working in his dad's hardware store, then wrote a book about these gathering places where the talk, the sounds, and the smells are all about tools.
I think a hardware store has a definite smell and a definite sound. You come into a place and it's sort of got paint, and it's got burnt motor oil, and it's got sawdust and glue and all the things they do in here. And I guess if you had to encapsulate it in one word, it'd be the smell of work. And you also have the sounds of work. And sometimes the sounds of work can actually be cheerful as the people are talking, asking questions about how you do this, how you do that. How much am I going to owe you?
Oh, today, about 32 cents.
You're sort of all a part of a hardware store community. And the meetings seem to convene every Saturday morning.
Throughout much of the 20th century, the hardware store was not only a place to learn how to use tools, but in Staten's case, it was an inspiration to learn the stories behind the tools.
This is for serious work here. This thing weighs a lot, costs a lot too, $33.99.
He was especially intrigued by a plumbing tool invented around 1850 that has become known as the monkey wrench. He actually titled his book,
Did Monkeys Invent the Monkey Wrench? You know, it'd be a great story if they did.
So, who did? According to Staten, Solomon Merrick owned a machine shop in Springfield, Massachusetts in the mid-1800s. One of his employees, John White, was working on ways to improve a British-made tool called the adjustable spanner wrench. Rumor has it that something about White's physical appearance earned him the nickname Monkey. Whenever anyone in the shop needed to borrow the wrench he was working on,
they would say, "Hey, can I use Monkey's wrench?" And that's how the adjustable spanner wrench became to be known as the monkey wrench.
There are other stories found in the aisles of hardware stores as well. You wouldn't think making a tool as simple as a shovel could be an act of treason, but for an American colonist, it was.
The colonies really were originally just supposed to be a market for British goods. And there was a guy named John Ames who started making shovels in 1774, which meant that was an act of treason.
Specifically, Ames committed treason because he was making shovels out of metal. During the colonial years, the British forbade the manufacture of metal tools and would not export any to the colonies. So men like Ames defiantly set up their own tool-making operations.
The British would only export wooden shovels to this country, so John Ames said that his metal shovels did damage to the earth, whereas the wooden shovels were damaged by the earth. When John Ames used to make these back in colonial days, he came up with two improvements. One was what's called the Ames bend. Before that, it was just straight up and down. And he figured that out because that made it a whole lot easier on people's backs with just that little bend. And also, he started tempering the blades, which made them thinner and more flexible and easier to go into the earth.
Another famous hardware name was born during the Industrial Revolution. In 1843, Frederick Stanley began a business in New Britain, Connecticut, but he wasn't making tools. The Stanley Bolt Manufactory made wrought iron bolts and hinges.
Stanley is sort of the name in hinges and hinge hardware, and the reason is because Stanley, when he started this company, I mean, lots of people were making hinges. His hinges were pretty much like everybody else's. He got the bright idea to package the screws in with the hinge. His took off. He became the name in hinges.
Selling hinges and screws together in clearly labeled boxes made Frederick Stanley very wealthy. It also sparked the growth of one of the world's largest tool companies. In 1920, Stanley Bolt Manufacturing merged with a company owned by a distant cousin of Frederick's. The Stanley Rule and Level Company started out selling boxwood and ivory levels and rulers before adding several other tools to their line. The company grew rapidly by buying out the patents of innovative but under-financed independent tool makers.
A lot of these companies, they were very small, they didn't have the horsepower to sell the product, but they had a good idea and they had smart people. And Stanley made a number of acquisitions to get a hold of the product line and the patent protection, and in several cases the people behind that, so that they could continue working for Stanley.
The patents of planemaker Leonard Bailey were by far some of their most successful acquisitions. With future acquisitions, Stanley would go on to produce just about every hand tool imaginable. Today's mass-produced tools might lack the beauty and individuality of earlier tools. But they are marvels of technology built on the shoulders of those early tool makers who worked so hard to make life easier. And while an innovation such as inserting a tuning fork into the handle of a hammer might beckon toward the future, it also connects us to our prehistoric past, with our ancestors who first made a tool from chipped stone. We share a key human trait.
Our desire and maybe even a drive to figure things out, figure how to do something better, figure how to alter something in order to make something work differently. I think that goes deep in our prehistoric past, that it has very, very deep roots, and now we've amplified it to the nth degree.
All these incredible advances in technology not only make tools easier to use, but they give us more free time for doing the things that we love, like working with tools. For Modern Marvels, I'm Ron Hazelton.